Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Budget Magic. So we're kind of winding down Eldritch Moon Standard, so I figured we would head to Modern this week, and we got a really sweet deck. So this is my take on kind of an old archetype in the format, Soul Sisters, but I'm calling it Stake Sisters because of a pretty unique card that we have added in. Anyway, as you can see, $94 in the paper world, 15 ticks on Magic Online, so super cheap, especially on Magic Online, but super cheap overall for the Modern format. A quick reminder before we break down the deck: if you enjoy Budget Magic and you enjoy this Stake Sisters deck, it would be amazing of you if you could take a quick second, click the like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. All those things are great ways that you can support the site for free. So let's talk about Stake Sisters. So the main idea of this deck is to play Soul Warden and Soul's Attendant. They're essentially the same card. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under anyone's control, for us or our opponent, we gain 1 life. So we want to get as many of these on the battlefield as possible, and it helps us gain a lot of life. So the life gain is nice in some matchups. If we run into aggressive decks, into burn decks, just having main deck life gain, and over the course of several turns, these creatures can gain a ton of life for us. It's not uncommon for us to get up to 30, 40, 50 life, or to be gaining so much life each turn that our opponent can be attacking us with a board full of creatures, and we just take it and then we gain all that life back. But just gaining life isn't good enough. There needs to be some payoffs for gaining life, and we'll get to those in a minute. But first, we have this unique combo with Norin of the Wary. So Norin of the Wary is one of the weirdest cards maybe ever printed in Magic. It's a 2/1 for 1 mana, legendary creature, and it says whenever a player plays a spell or a creature attacks, you remove Norin from the game, so you exile it, and then at the end of turn, it comes back into play. So the cool thing with Norin is it's a way for us to get more Soul Warden and Soul Attendant triggers. So it blinks itself whenever we cast any spell, whenever our opponent casts any spell, and then it comes back in on our end step. So it can't really attack because it'll get exiled. It can't really get killed by removal because it'll exile itself in response to removal. So it's essentially unkillable and does absolutely nothing except give us a human warrior that enters the battlefield every single turn. So with the Norin, say we cast a creature, we will gain life from our Soul Wardens and our Soul Attendants from the creature. Norin will exile at the end of our turn. Norin will come back in. It'll trigger our Soul Wardens and Soul Attendants again. The second piece of the combo that really gets things out of control is Genesis Chamber, this weird 2-mana artifact that says whenever a non-token creature comes into play, if Genesis Wave is untapped, the creature's controller gets a 1/1 mirror artifact creature token. So we get this, our opponent gets it. It's kind of a symmetrical effect, and we've talked a lot about symmetrical effects and how to build around them recently, but the way that we build around Genesis Chamber is this package right here. So we get a 1/1 token whenever a creature comes into play under our control. Our opponent gets the same thing, but when we get the 1/1 mirror token, it not only triggers our Soul Wardens and Soul Attendants, but we get those tokens from Norin every single turn. So every single turn, we are blinking our Norin on our turn and on our opponent's turn. It's coming into play. We're gaining a bunch of life from the Soul Wardens and Soul Attendants, and we're getting this huge stream of mirror tokens, which gives us endless chump blockers and eventually helps us win the game. So this is kind of the core of the deck, is Soul Wardens, this endless blinking of Norin, making tokens to get even more Soul Warden triggers. Then what are the payoffs for gaining all this life and making all these creatures? Well, the first one is Ajani's Pridemate. Pretty straightforward here. A 2-mana 2/2 that says whenever you gain life, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Ajani's Pridemate. So ideally, we'll go like Soul Warden into a Soul Warden plus tap land on turn 2. Then on turn 3, we play Johnny's Pridemate. It'll trigger both Soul Wardens, and we'll end up with a 4/4 Johnny's Pridemate. It also benefits from the Norin blinking, triggering the Soul Wardens, getting more counters. It's very realistic that within a turn cycle or two, a Johnny's Pridemate can be a 15/15 or grow as far as like a 30/30. It just gets absolutely massive. So it gets out of range of anything except the most unconditional removal, terminates Path to Exiles, but you're not going to burn it to death or anything like that, and it's a really fast clock to close out the game. It turns into the Abyss really quickly, where if our opponent takes one hit from it, they're going to die, so they just have to keep chump blocking and chump blocking. The second way we take advantage of this process is with Champion of the Parish. So Soul's Attendant is a human, Norin of the Wary is a human, Champion of the Parish is a 1/1 for 1 that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a human enters the battlefield, so we have some random humans, plus the real combo here is the Norin blink, so on our turn we're blinking Norin, on our opponent's turn we're likely blinking Norin, so each turn cycle we're putting counters on Champion of the Parish, so this is a 1-drop that often ends up growing to 5 power, 7 power, 9 power, and again, not as dominant as a Johnny's Pridemate, but it still gets big enough that our opponent is really forced to deal with this 1-mana creature, or else it's going to just take over the game, thanks to the constant blinking from Norin. So those are 2 of our big payoff cards. We also have 4 Squadron Hawks, and these don't have any real major purpose, other than they're flying chump blockers, and they get us a lot of creature entering the battlefield triggers. So we only need to draw 1 of them, and then we get to get the whole squadron out of our library, which means for the next 2 or 3 turns, we're going to have creatures to play to gain life from our Soul Sisters, to trigger our token production, to blink our Norin, so it just makes sure that all of our other abilities are triggering. So Squadron Hawk is really good for that. Plus, it gets in the way of random flying things from Affinity with cranial plating like Vault Scourge, gets in the way of Inkmoth Nexus out of Infect and things like that. And then the namesake card, the card that makes this deck kind of unique, is Burn at the Stake. So I haven't really played with Soul Sisters much before, but I've played against it a lot, and one thing I've noticed about the deck is it's really good at staying alive because you're gaining all this life. It's fairly good at going wide, but it often gets into these big board stalls where it just gains a bunch of life, but doesn't really close out the game. Well, Burn at the Stake is the solution to this problem. It's a 5-mana sorcery. You get to tap any number of creatures you control when you cast it. And remember, we are making a ton of Mirror tokens, we are getting these Squadron Hawks, we got all these Soul Sisters, so it's not uncommon for our board to be very cluttered with creatures. And for each creature that we tap, Burn at the Stake deals 3 times that number of damage to a creature or player. So if we tap 5 creatures, very easy, we often have that many, we deal 15 damage to our opponent. If we tap 10 creatures, it's 30 damage. So basically, this card is very usually on turn 5, on turn 6, tap all of our stuff, and just kill our opponent in one shot. So that's where the stake part of Stake Sisters comes from. We have this really awesome burn spell to close out the game that a lot of other Soul Sisters decks don't have to take advantage of. The rest of the main deck, we have one more card that kind of plays on the fact we make so many creatures and get all these Mirror tokens and outnumber. So I was thinking we needed Path to Exile. Path to Exile would be good in this deck, but it's like $10 a copy, which is a lot for the budget. In our deck, where we're going wide and making all these creatures, Outnumber can do a pretty good impression. It's not as good on turn 1, it's not as guaranteed to get rid of something, but Outnumber can kill most things, and it's not that uncommon that our deck can shoot down a Tarmogoyf that's a 5/6, for example, for just 1 mana with Outnumber, and then some Lightning Bolts, which do double duty, killing early game creatures, also going to our opponent's face. As far as the mana base, we have some more ways to make tokens. So the tokens don't really pump up our Champion of the Parish. They don't blink our Norin, but what they do is trigger all of our Soul Warden effects to pump up our Johnny's Pridemate and things like that. So Karakeep, 1 in a red, makes a token, also a colorless land. Westfall Abbey is kind of a backup finisher as well. We make a bunch of Mirror tokens from Genesis Chamber, and then we can just flip around our Westfall Abbey into an Ormondal, win that way. Windscarred Crag, so bad, the tap duel, but I wanted to mention it because it does synergize well with the Johnny's Pridemate. If we play a Pridemate on turn 3, for example, we can play Windscarred Crag as a tap land, gain a life, pump up our Johnny's Pridemate. So there is a little bit of synergy there, but it's still not that great. The rest of our mana base, we have a Mistful Plains. We can potentially get infinite Squadron Hawks, where we keep putting them back on the bottom of our library to search them up with other Squadron Hawks, keep getting our Enter the Battlefield triggers. Battlefield Forge and Temple of Triumph is budget duels, and then Plains and Mountains to round things out. In the sideboard, we get some more removal. We got Sudden Shock because I was worried about Infect primarily, because Infect doesn't really care how much life we gain. So they can just one-shot us with a Blighted Agent, with a Glistener Elf even, with an Inkmoth Nexus. Sudden Shock is a great burn spell for those matchups since they can't respond with a pump spell. Then the Missing Lightning Bolt, the Missing Outnumber for more removal. We also have Outpost Siege and Boros Charm, which are more for control decks. Outpost Siege can help us grind out card advantage against mid-range decks like Abzan and Jund that can kill a lot of our stuff, or even dedicated control decks just to draw an extra card every turn. Plus, if we do go wide and have a lot of creatures, we can stick it on Dragon's mode, and if our opponent wraths, it's likely going to kill them because they take a damage for each one of our creatures that dies. And then Boros Charm is to protect our creatures. We're very susceptible to Pyroclasms, Anger of the Gods, things like that, because our creatures, apart from like a Johnny's Pride Mane and Champion of the Parish growing over a couple of turns, most of our creatures are 1/1s, so even inexpensive sweepers like Pyroclasm can wrath our entire board. A Boros Charm gives everything indestructible, keeps that from happening. Wear Tear for artifacts and enchantments. If you're playing both white and red, Wear Tear is just a great sideboard card. And then a couple of Witchbane Orbs as our version of Leyline of Sanctity, since the real version is a little bit too expensive, but helps against decks that can target our face. The Valakut combo, for example, theoretically can do enough damage to kill us through our Soul Sisters if they're fast enough, things like that. Witchbane Orb helps there. And that is Stake Sisters for Modern. So this deck is really sweet. It's really fun. And it seems pretty competitive. I really like the Burn at the Stake edition. The rest of the deck is fairly straightforward, pretty typical. Soul Sisters is a real archetype, the Norin blinking with Genesis Chamber. So the real big innovations are things that you don't normally see in this archetype, I think, are Outnumber as a budget version of Path, which is pretty solid, and Burn at the Stake, which just helps the deck close out games so much faster and doesn't give our opponent so many draw steps to find something to actually beat us, because all of a sudden it's just like, boom, you're dead on the spot. Takes advantage of the fact that there's not that many counters floating around. People aren't really playing too many remands and mana leaks and so forth, so tapping out for a 5-mana burn spell actually isn't the end of the world. So, and the other great thing about this deck is there's a lot of aggressive decks in the format, and we naturally have good matchups against Burn and Zoo, even Affinity in a lot of draws, just because we gain so much life. And these are cards that are not only gaining us life, it's not like we're playing a Stream of Life or something that's just horrible for the sake of gaining life. These are also combo pieces, so we're not only gaining life, but they're life gain cards that are actually comboing off and putting counters on things and doing other stuff as well, so we naturally get good matchups against some aggro decks. So I really like that aspect of it as well. Like I said, we can be susceptible to sweepers, Pyroclasms, Anger of the Gods. Those are probably the most problematic cards. Boros Charm helps, but we only got 2 in the sideboard, so we can still get blown out by those things. But I really like what this deck can do in a lot of matchups just by kind of comboing off, gaining so much life that we get out of the danger zone, and growing threats that become absolutely massive, then suddenly closing out the game out of nowhere with Burn at the Stake, or as a backup, flipping around a Westville Abbey into Ormondal by sacking out our mirror tokens and stuff. So I think this one's sweet. I had a ton of fun playing it, and on Magic Online in specific, it's really a free roll, and even in paper, it's not really that bad. Like, Norin's a little expensive because it's old, but it's still a very cheap deck for Modern, and a reasonable deck that has some good paths to upgrades. There have been versions of Soul Sisters that have spiked tournaments and done well, so there's a couple different directions you can go with upgrades too, which is always nice if you're going to invest in a budget deck, to know that there's non-budget things you can build towards that are actually pretty competitive and pretty good. So anyway, that's been our deck for Stake Sisters. I hope you enjoy the gameplay videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you soon.